Crossing the Wilderness, How the Buddha Narrates His Own Travels. Sarah Shaw. In this paper, I would like to look at a travel story of a different kind. It describes a physical journey, but begins a collection of stories about travel in a larger sense. The journey of one individual and his followers across many lifetimes and rebirths as different kinds of animal, human, and God. The Jatakas, or birth stories as they are sometimes known, are a collection of 547 tales dating from about the 3rd century BCE. Each describes a bodhisattva, the future Buddha, as he is reborn in different conditions in preparation for his final rebirth, in which he becomes not only enlightened but, on the basis of these countless lifetimes of experience, able to teach others. All are linked by the narrator Sam, or I, the method by which the Buddha, fully enlightened, discloses and acknowledges as his own a particular identity or character at the end of each tale. The tales are intended to inform, encourage, and inspire Buddhist practitioners, and are constantly told to children and adults throughout Buddhist countries. Several come to be associated with one of 10 perfections, moral qualities that need to be developed in the preparation for Buddhahood. Vigor is, for instance, developed when the bodhisattva is a prince who swims for days at sea after a shipwreck. Loving kindness, when the bodhisattva, born as a deer, by his fearlessness deflects the aggression of a king who wants to kill him. Buddhists in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia who may not know anything of other canonical texts grow up with Jataka stories, and they are repositories of folk Buddhism that informs the thinking, customs, and even legal systems of these countries. In Laos, for instance, precedents from Jataka Tales have even been used in courts of law. The way these tales are painted, carved, and drawn in temples throughout the East suggests a kind of travel. Episodes from these tales, with the bodhisattva in different guises, as human, monkey, elephant, goose, cat, hare, or even mouse, make friezes which adorn shrine rooms throughout Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Laos, and Cambodia, as well as the ancient Buddhist sites of Ajanta and Sanchi in India and Borobudur in Indonesia. A visitor walks past and may stop to look at depictions of them as he makes his way into a shrine hall. Murals shown on the outside wall or in the approach to the temple accompany the movement from the world of activity outside to the quiet space of the interior, where the figure of the Buddha is placed and respected on a shrine. Here the stories are also sometimes painted on the walls as one approaches the shrine itself in a site. Such as Borobudur, this walking becomes a kind of meditative journey. In order to see all the reliefs on the outside of the stupa in their correct order, the visitor needs to circumambulate it 10 times through depictions of past lives of the Buddha and the realms of existence. The monumentally long Vesantara Jataka, the last of the tales and the only one that has been well translated in recent years, is simply the most popular story in most Buddhist countries. Friezes depicting scenes from it are frequent at the entrance into a shrine hall. The stories as a whole are, as Richard Gombrich points out, one of the world's oldest and largest collection of folk tales. They are also interesting from a narrative point of view. They must be the only collection of stories in the world linked by the experiences of one central character through many lives. It is in this more far-reaching sense of travel across many lives that the idea of a journey informs early Buddhists understand about the nature of our experience of existence and of the way to be free within it, the collection as a whole and the frame story. But before we move any further, I should explain a little the textual history of the Jataka stories, and the way that this highly varied collection of tales about the past lives of the Buddha is held together. The evolution, structure, and historical dating straight of the text raise issues which are rather complex, so I will try to summarize them in as concise a way as I can, with apologies for any inevitable omissions or generalizations. The earliest form of the Jatakas are the verses which accompany the stories, which are very old, some possibly predating Buddhism. The Jatakas, like other early Buddhist texts, arose as part of an oral tradition and were not written down for centuries. The language they are composed in is Pali, a form of Middle Indo-Aryan that seems to be close to the language spoken by the historical Buddha. It seems that the verses at an early date became settled and regarded as canonical. Perhaps because good storytelling is so often an extemporizing art, the stories themselves did not become fixed then, though their presence is implied in the verses, which make little sense without them. The stories that we have are later formulations, and technically known as commentary. There is also a long frame narrative, usually regarded as a book in itself, which is a later addition, though a beautifully simple and helpful one. It supplies what the stories do not, A full life story of the Buddha in his last lifetime, preceded by a description of a life in the far past in which he makes the resolve to become a bodhisattva and to develop the 10 perfections through countless lives. It gives us a clear point of origin for the tales, a linking device that clarifies the intention of the stories as a whole and the present context of the Buddha's teaching. It is in many ways, though, an independent work, and its description of the taking of the bodhisattva vow, the undertaking to fulfill perfections and the presence of a particular figure, Daipa Integral Kara, an earlier Buddha who witnesses the vow, has woven in some elements in Buddhist thought that emerged a little later in the tradition. The fact that the stories describe a series of lives of a central character searching for enlightenment, though, suggests the presence of some sort of tale that explains why he started doing this. Perhaps the work existed from the earliest times, though it is unlikely it was in this form. As it stands, it is a work in its own right, and for the purposes of this paper, I am not including it here, but will refer to it as the frame story. Instead, I am looking at the first story and the unifying principles, which are provided by the pattern governing the structure of each of the tales. This is extremely effective and, to an audience used to hearing the tales, gives a pleasing familiarity to any story, as elements that are repeated throughout will be recognized whenever any Jataka is told. They always begin, continue, and end in a similar way. It starts with the Buddha, described in the third person, as a participant or watcher in a particular incident in the present. Perhaps some monks are quarreling or an odd marital feud has erupted. On the basis of this incident, Pakapanavathatu, the Buddha decides to tell a story of an earlier life from which it soon emerges that the characters, usually under different names or even in a different form of rebirth such as an animal, had a tendency to get into the same sort of problem long ago. This gives us the main body of the story, Adadavathu, and most of the tales start with the evocative atite, once upon a time or in times long past. Only the Buddha, with his omniscient knowledge of the past lives of the characters involved, is in a position to recollect all the details of the past for those who are listening. In this past story, he appears as a character like any other, is described in the third person, and has another name in that rebirth, though frequent use of terms such as bodhisattva or the mahasattva, a word rather like our hero, ensure that the reader knows who is meant. His behavior also marks him out as different. He will be the one who is more heroic or skilled or kind-hearted in some way, though he features sometimes just as a witness to the action. As he is not enlightened, his actions are not always perfect. Because the material is drawn from such a diversity of folk sources, he really does have a distinct character and different identity in his various rebirths, though he is usually treated as in some way exemplary. The story always includes verses gatha, the earliest layer of the text. These vary in function and quality from simple folk homily to what are sometimes extended lyrical and emotional accompaniments to the story. They do not tend to be mechanisms for moving the plot, and sometimes include poetic interjections and comments attributed to the Buddha in the present. Though this is always noted when it occurs, at the end of the tale, the threads from the different aspects of the story are tied together. The Buddha, still described in the third person, gives a short speech making appropriate connections, samadhana. He assigns each character a counterpart in the present life, and then reveals last the part he has played himself, with the first person, aham. This revelation and acknowledgement of the earlier identity of the Buddha occurs at the end of each tale, and provides us, along with the structure of the stories, an underlying pattern that links together what would otherwise be an unusually diverse group of stories, of many different genres and narrative methods. There are a number of points to consider about the Jatakas, and the place of the first tale in particular, but rather than discussing them in the abstract, I will go straight into the tale itself, and use that as the basis from which to explore its place in the collection as a whole. The story. In this case, the first section, the story from the present, is quite long, and consists in large part of a eulogy of the Buddha himself. The character in the present who has become fully awakened, is able to teach and inspire others, and who has spent countless lifetimes in preparation for the job of disseminating a teaching that will enable others to free themselves. In this regard, it is clearly intended as an opening to the tales as a whole. It is, as one could argue, as a frame story, in many ways an elaboration of a device found throughout the Pali Canon, whereby a homage is paid to the Buddha at the beginning of the text. We do not know at what stage it became routine as an introduction, but the short preliminary, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sammasambuddhassa, homage to the Exalted One, the Enlightened One, the fully awakened Buddha, prefaces all the collections in the Pali Text Society. It precedes both the frame story and the first Jataka itself. It is a usual way of beginning any auspicious undertaking in a Buddhist country. I once heard it chanted on a coach in Sri Lanka as the village set off on a pilgrimage. Considering the aspects of the Buddha in all his different characteristics is also one of the meditation practices of the Pali Canon. A single meditation subject, Buddhanussati, it often accompanies two other meditations, the recollection of the Dhamma, the teaching, and the Sangha, the assembly of monks, nuns, and those who have followed the teaching of the past. The three are called the triple gem. These samatha, or calming, practices are particularly recommended for the laity in the canon for arousing cheerfulness and happiness in daily life, and are constantly taught as ways of keeping the mind awake and in good spirits during the day. In this preliminary tale, we are presented with the Buddha as a teacher and 500 disciples of other teachers who are friends of the treasurer and of the Pitaka. These are proponents of views that are famous within the canon for their opinionatedness. They hold beliefs that our fates are fixed and predestined, for instance, or that there are no good or bad consequences to our actions. Converted once by the Buddha, these 500 followers have relapsed, and the story describes the Buddha's response to this before they join him again. He tells them that they have given themselves up into a wilderness of views and opinions, and that they have sought refuge where there is none to be why, recollecting the qualities of the triple gem, they will attain complete freedom. This preliminary story arouses consideration of the figure of the glorious appearance and inspiring teaching of the Buddha, the hero whose contemplation would arouse great confidence in his followers. It also, as was pointed out to me by a research student here in Oxford, makes an unusual claim for meditations, which are always felt to be helpful, but not generally regarded as solvent. IT stresses that recollection of the qualities of the triple gem are the only true refuge, and that they lead to enlightenment. The text is emphasizing, right at the beginning, a series of popular meditation practices which are particularly aimed at laymen, and which seem here to be accorded unlimited potential. This perhaps does not mean they are the only practices one should do. There are many other meditations advised in the canon. In a Buddhist context, it is a striking claim, though, and one which distinguishes the first part of the first story on its own. I do not think it is made elsewhere amongst the tales. The Buddha then asked the treasurer to listen, explaining that he has spent countless lifetimes cultivating the perfections, so that he can help other beings. In order to illustrate his points about the followers, the Buddha compares the situation now to a series of events in the past, which he proceeds to relate in a formula we again do not find elsewhere in the tales. As of breaking open the birthplace of the snow and releasing the full moon, he made clear what the gap between this and the previous life had kept hidden. This section of the narrative has been indisputably Buddhist. The extended description of the teacher, the references to the recollection of the triple gem, and the formula with which the story from the past is introduced all point to a preliminary story carefully designed to awaken faith in the figure of the Buddha, his teaching, and his followers. The first story set in the past, like many of the collection, is more of a folk tale, describing a journey. The Bodhisattva, a caravan leader who trades with 500 carts, going from east to west and west back to east, loads up all his carts with merchandise and prepares to cross a wilderness. Another foolish trader does exactly the same thing and intends to set off at the same time. The Bodhisattva, seeing the danger in having too many wagons on a road at the same time, all using wood, grass, and water, offers the other the choice of going first or second. The other, greedily perceiving an advantage in beating the Bodhisattva to market, opts for going first. The Bodhisattva, however, sees some advantages in going second. Wells are dug. There will be a fresh, new growth of herbs and prices will already be fixed. The foolish merchant sets off on the desert wilderness, well prepared, with 60 jars of water. On the way, however, he meets a yaka or demon who decides to play a trick on them. He conjures up a magic carriage drawn by white bulls and surrounds himself with a retinue of more demons with bows and arrows, with clothes and hair all dripping wet, lotuses in their hair, chewing luscious lotus stalks themselves. Persuading the caravan trader that there is water where there is a dark streak ahead, presumably a mirage, the yaka successfully enjoins him to empty out all his water so that he can make faster progress. When they come to pitch tent, exhausted, thirsty, and dried out, the demon eats them all. The same trick is tried on the Bodhisattva, who is not so gullible. He dissuades his followers from doing what the demon asks by asking questions to which they find the answers themselves. Why are there no rain clouds, no sound of thunder, and no evidence of the winds that accompany rain? Realizing himself that he is dealing with demons, whose red eyes and the fact they cast no shadow always betray their true identity to the observant, he persuades his followers to see for themselves the defects in the arguments, not to throw away their water, and keep vigilant at night. Because of this, they all cross the wilderness safely, add the goods of the dead merchants to their own, and make a very tidy profit when they reach the city. The story, which is entitled A True Story, or A Story About Truth, elaborates this idea of truth in a single verse, commenting on the wisdom of following what is true rather than clever falsity. The final, connecting statement is made by the Buddha, in which he says that Devdatta, his rival over many lifetimes, was a foolish merchant. His followers, those that accompanied him. The Buddha and his followers were the wise ones. The metaphor of travel in Indian philosophy. We have had in the first part a discussion of the great qualities of the Buddha, but here we have an application of these when he is the Bodhisattva. The story is a simple tale of physical travel. For ancient and modern, Indians' existence itself is perceived as a kind of travel. According to the Indian traditions of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, all living beings exist in endless cycles and rebirths of wandering. The word samsara, derived from the root form samsri, means to flow together with, to go about, wander or walk or roam through, to walk or pass through a succession of states, undergo transmigration, enter or pass into. It implies endless travel, but of a somewhat fruitless or aimless kind. It comes to be used within early Buddhism to denote the state of all beings as they pass from one life to another without ceasing until they find release. Within Buddhism, words connected with more directed form of travel are also used to express the means by which we can free ourselves from that samsara. The content of the first sermon of the Buddha describes this eightfold path of right view, understanding, speech, livelihood, action, mindfulness, effort, and concentration. It uses the same word, magga. One would apply to a local thoroughfare like the Cowley Road, for instance, and is employed for road in this first tale. The word applies to any path that takes people from one place to another. The Buddha's teaching is elsewhere likened to a path that the Buddha has found just as a man might cut through an overgrown track in a jungle, which leads to a beautiful forgotten city. The word path has levels of meaning according to a particular area of Buddhist thought. In the philosophical tradition of Abhidhamma, it refers to the attainment of stages along the way to enlightenment and, specifically, the moment of enlightenment itself. The T.O. travel along this path is to find the means of release and escape from wandering. It refers also to the attainment of the four graded spiritual states, of which the last is full enlightenment. Stream entry, the moment when one first perceived the path, one return, non-return, and arahatship. These are mentioned in the first part of the story in connection with the recollection of the Triple Gem. So path applies to the daily practice of life as a Buddhist, the way to the end of suffering and to the final fruition of all factors of the path in the awakened mind. Only enlightenment itself reveals it in its entirety. Travel and movement from one place to another are certainly not the only analogies used by the Buddha to describe his teaching. Metaphors and similes in Buddhism tend to be used in richly various ways, as these stories show us. But the idea that how we behave, speak, think, and deal with others places us on some sort of road and gives us the means to travel, and that this path will lead eventually to the end of suffering, indicates how deeply the association of movement in a certain direction is, equated to the means and the end of spiritual development. Further images employed within early Buddhism reinforce this association. The word of crossing over, for instance, with its associations of finding a further shore and passing over a gulf, is used to describe the way to enlightenment. The raft is taken as a teaching that takes us across an otherwise impassable river. Samsara is also sometimes likened to an ocean. In the Vesantar, Jataka the Bodhisattva entreats his son with the words, "Be a steady boat to carry me on the sea of becoming. I shall cross to the further shore of birth, and make the world with its gods cross also." It seems apt that the followers who have left the path are compared to those who are not sensible and so cannot cross the terrible wilderness. Elsewhere in the Pali Canon, the idea of a wilderness is used to express a state of skepticism and a kind of doubt that corrodes genuine search and investigation. In the Samanaphala Sutta, the same word, kintara, is used in a simile that describes overcoming the 5 hindrances to the meditation practice and a healthy and skillful mind, kusala siddha. Its placing as a fifth simile concerned indicates, as the commentaries point out, an association with doubt, the fifth hindrance. I think most of us today would use the word to describe a state of spiritual desolation or a feeling of abandonment. One only has to fly over the subcontinent today to sense the power and sense of danger desert wastes would have held for ancient Indians. In early Buddhism, it is used to express existence itself. In the Padasambhadamika, the Buddha is quoted as saying, under the section on the Great Compassion, "Worldly life has entered a great wilderness. There is none other than myself to get across the wilderness." I do not know if this meaning, so redolent of the first lines of both Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and Dante's Divine Comedy, applies to the first tale too. It seems a very suitable image, though, for the outset of a collection of tales of which 547 separate and distinct identities across many eons of time are described and explored. The Merchant. The first story and its preliminary are fairly simple and self-explanatory. The preliminary and the present give a paean to the teacher and describes him encountering a situation of doubt, while the story itself gives an imaginative embodiment of the problem in a journey across a literal wilderness. The story describes the triumph of common sense, care in testing all new propositions, and the ability not to take the obvious or seductive course of action. The followers discover the truth through their own questioning and take nothing on faith, one of the central tenets of the Buddhist teaching, which is described as ehipassiko, come and see, or come and see for yourself. These are very pragmatic, careful, and even unassuming virtues, and bring us a feature that is worth examining a little further. During the course of the stories, the Bodhisattva undergoes many transformations and is reborn in all classes of society, as well as an animal rebirth. I end those near the beginning of the collection. He is quite often an animal, while in those toward the end, he is usually human and often royal, though there is not much more of a pattern to be discerned in this. The tales are collected on the Yuji Vedic scheme of an ascending number of verses, so that the first 150 are all grouped together only because they have one verse. The second Vagga includes those with 2, and so on in an ascending sequence. The last Vagga of 10 tales has the ones with the most verses. This does not at first sight accompany any other aesthetic sequence, nor is there any obvious development or progress in the type of rebirth. For instance, the Bodhisattva is a prince, a god, a king, and usually a human in some of the early Jatakas, which have only one verse, while in one of the very late stories in the 21st Vagga, 533, which has many verses, he is born as a goose, though a very noble one. The last 10 stories have acquired particular importance, particularly in Southeast Asia. A great deal of verse suggests a large amount of poetry, and a likely debt to traditions such as epic and drama. Generalizations are crude in this context, but a story with many verses is more likely to have affinities with such genres. So these last 10 are in many ways extended folk epics. For whatever reason, they are the most popular and widely depicted of the tales. Their length and complexity certainly allows for a great deal of drama, ambiguity, characterization, and detailed explorations of moral dilemmas and doctrinal points. Chronology does not seem to be much of a factor in this arrangement, though Vesantara is usually regarded as the last human birth in a temporal sense, as are all the last 10, which are given prominence in Thailand and in other countries, and each associated with perfection. These are not necessarily the same as the ones assigned by the Korea Pitaka or the introduction to the Jatakas, suggesting a later or different tradition attached to these attributions. But an aesthetic, chronological, and spiritual importance has at some point been assigned to these last 10 stories. They are perceived as significant throughout the East, as representing some sort of summation or completion of the task of fulfilling the 10 perfections. But what about the beginning? Is that significant? The first Vagga of stories with single verses, which includes many very popular tales like the Makja Jataka, in which the Bodhisattva is a kindly fish, does not seem to have any aesthetic shape. The rebirths do not follow any pattern or apparently involve a sense of progress. The Aesop-like pithiness of the single-verse method is well suited to the moral fables concerning an animal rebirth. Although there are not as many as a human, there are quite a few of these, though without any obvious pattern in their arrangement. The stories tend to involve situations which can be summarized by a short formulation of the teaching. The single verse is often in practice a general homily or folk truth, expressed in a catchy and memorable form which for obvious reasons does not involve lengthy poetic or lyric description. All of this is inconclusive and does not suggest any obvious chronological beginning or any sense of progress. There are quite a few lower rebirths, but they do not predominate. As we have seen, there are nonetheless various thematic reasons for this, as the choice of the first tale. It includes in the first part a homage to the Buddha and a statement of the efficacy of recollecting his virtues, his teaching, and his followers. It then, in describing one of the lives that have contributed to these, includes a literal path, a wilderness, and a journey through inhospitable terrain. The teaching is enacted in his method of dealing with the Yaka and his followers. So the choice of a hero for the first tale also to me suggests deliberation. It is a kind of middle ground in rebirths. It is not regal, courtly, nor heavenly. It is not an animal one either, technically known as a descent. We do know that many early Buddhists were drawn from the mercantile class. Donations are recorded from merchants on early inscriptions, who seem to have acquired a social status higher than they had in Vedic times. It would be fitting that the first story in this collection speaks to an audience who appear to have received Buddhism so favorably. A practical, shrewd, and kindly trader, not averse to making a good profit yet mindful of his responsibilities to his dependents, seems to me the ancient Indian counterpart of the bourgeois common man, intent on applying Buddhist principles of generosity and restraint to his own circumstances and making them work. It is just these careful qualities which, it is suggested, keep those in a higher life as monks on the right path so that they do not fall into harm. It implies also not just a certain target audience, but also a means by which the tales may have become so widespread. We do not know the nature of the audience to whom the Jatakas were addressed, but we do know that while they have remained rooted within the countries of Buddhist practice, they themselves tended to travel too. Buddhism arose in a time of great mercantile and urban development in India, and we find the tales spreading over the next centuries as trade and communications open up in China and Central Asia in the 1st century CE. We even find a striking similarity to one of them in Chaucer, over 1,000 years later. It is a notoriously difficult area of research, but I would imagine that merchants on trade routes for silks and other goods, swapping stories, must be in part responsible for this. It seems likely that the merchants appropriated such popularly accessible tales, and that the laity drawn from this class will have been well represented amongst their early audiences. Beginnings. If we open an anthology of poems or collection of stories in the West, we assume that the choice of the first text is in some sense significant. The first poem or story in a collection interests us. It may not be the best, but we would feel that it has been chosen to awaken a mood for the collection as a whole, perhaps setting in motion themes and ideas which come into play or are explored through the rest of the work. It lingers in the mind as in some sense our initial and most important contact with the text as a whole. Indeed, there are many books, poems, plays, and novels memorable precisely because of the way the author interested us first. We do not make such assumptions about collections of early Buddhist texts. In the first place, they are not apparently the product of a single creative mind, but were, according to tradition, collected by the followers of the Buddha at various councils after his death. From a historical point of view, it is generally agreed that in practice they evolved over a period of time as they were chanted and handed down by various Vedic traditions of reciters, groups of monks entrusted with this task. As the text that may be chanted on any occasion may not be the first one in a collection, it could be argued that no mood needs to be set at all by the one placed at the beginning. Texts were not composed or grouped together with an eye to a reader, but to an audience who will be listening to them over what may have been a long period of time, such as an overnight session. Constant contact with texts chanted in this way is part of Southeast Asian Buddhist background. Peace and reassurance will be found just by hearing them, and recognizing the familiar features of the oral tradition. Perhaps because of this, we do not usually speak of the text's author, and do not tend to focus on the artistry and the composition of the suttas, as they are called, or other canonical Buddhist texts. But these factors need not preclude artistic considerations, or the exercise of care in making a good beginning. Indeed, the phrase eva me suttam, thus have I heard, begins many, if not most, of the suttas, and is both a preparation for the hearer and an acknowledgement of those who have sustained the teaching. A highly personal statement. It nonetheless pays respects to those from whom the texts have been heard and who have shaped the form they take. While the history of the tradition has tended to stress other aspects of the text, such as the spiritual, the philosophical, or the ethical, There's evidence of great care and skill employed by these unknown compilers, which has contributed to the text construction. If we examine this craft further, we find that in the course of process of transmission, various emphases and excellences also seem to have emerged in the collections, which are now being acknowledged by contemporary scholarship. It seems to me that all the major collections of early Buddhist texts have significant and pertinent beginnings, and that when we come to look at them more from the point of view of their literary artistry, it will become clear that such an appraisal need not detract from our sense of the Buddha's creativity as a teacher. It rather enhances it, by placing it in a context where humor, drama, and poetry and a sense of the aesthetic shape of collection as a whole give substance to our interpretation of how the Buddha taught and behaved. The first text of the Dhyana, the Brahmajala Sutta, for instance, is an impressive choice to begin the series of lengthy texts. It has, though, a decidedly low-key frame story, involving a curious interchange between a teacher and his disciple as they follow, literally, in the footsteps of the Buddha on the road to Nalanda. It is a simple and very human beginning to the major Buddhist text on wrong views. The first Jataka story seems to have been chosen for the encapsulation of the themes of the collection as a whole. A story of a safe journey across a wilderness. It designates the beginning of a larger one, the description of a simple merchant. It represents the Bodhisattva as a common man before the extensive explorations of the animal realms, and before the complex moral choices that are dramatized in the last 10 rebirths. It occurs after a homage to the central character, and like each of the tales, a way of exploring and revealing his true identity, the first-person aham that is only revealed at the conclusion of the tale. I mentioned earlier that the preliminary story in the present specifically mentions the recollection of the Buddha as a meditation practice with limitless potential, an unusual claim for an early Pali text. A question I have not dealt with is that of no-self. How can a collection of stories where the Buddha is described as I embody a doctrine where there is no I? R.F. Gombrich points out that the stories are an example of folk Buddhism, intended for the general populace, who would not want to think too deeply about such matters. It seems to me that one way this method is so successful is through the flexibility of the narrative method, with its shifts of perspective that allow us to move from the present to the past and back again within each tale before that identity is dissolved and a new story begins. The contradiction between the self that finds out that there is no self is one that provides a dramatic thread throughout this journey of lives. Each story starts with the awakened mind, describes it at one remove, so to speak, in a past in which the Bodhisattva was not enlightened, and then returns to the awakened mind at the end. Sue Hamilton, in Early Buddhism, A New Approach, writes, It has come to seem to me that the Buddhist teachings in the Sutta Pitaka emphasize, above all else, the centrality of personal experience. Moreover, we all experience the notion of identity, being human being A and not human being B. In the Jatakas, the Buddha travels through and experiences many identities, but is the only character in the tales who remembers and is free from them all. The reader or hearer does not really think much about the doctrine of no-self at all. It is enacted for him through the separate and distinct experiences of the Bodhisattva recollected by the Buddha in the present. The Jatakas then seem to me to be a skillfully constructed journey through a wilderness of lives, linking the Buddha with all kinds of conditions, yet starting with a common man, the kind of person very likely to be listening to them, like the entrance to a temple in the East. The tales give us a way of traveling through an extended recollection of the qualities. They reveal the impermanence of each life before moving on to the next, and so elucidate a path for finding at the end of each tale the refuge of the awakened mind, free from any I making at all.